The organization I represent, the Hispanic Federation, is co-presenting this forum today with amazing organizations. Let me introduce them now. Alianza Americas. Let's give a big round of applause for Alianza. Thank you. The Labor Council for Latin American Advancement. Aplausos. And our great friends here in the DC area, CARECEN-DC. Let's give it up for CARECEN. So let me just say that all these organizations, we are thrilled that you're here. We're grateful that you're here because we know that there's always 1,000,001 different priorities. I mean, you could be, doing 1,000,001 things, being on the Capitol, protesting, marching, 1,000,000 things to do here in DC, which is always a lot of fun. But you have prioritized being here. And that is critically important. And you have prioritized being here because you understand the importance of this issue. And in fact, the fact that you are here speaks volumes. It says, it affirms what we share, the belief that nothing is more important than our children and families. Nothing is more important than our children and families. That family is at the heart of everything that binds us as a people, binds us as a culture, binds us as a civilization, and it is the very essence of humanity. Right? There is no humanity without families. There is no civilization without family. And that being the case, there is no greater harm than you can inflict on us than tearing apart our families. That is the case for Latinos, it is the case for Asian Americans, it is the case for Muslims, it is the case for any people that walk this earth, right? There is no greater harm than you can instill on a people than tearing apart their families, taking away their children, separating mother from child, child from parents. It is the stripping away of the very reason we exist. It is the stripping away of our very humanity. And yet, right, this is exactly what's happening in our country today. That is exactly what is happening across our country today. If you think about just the idea, just the very notion of family separation, that's morally repugnant. Even if you had it as an idea to say, I want to separate, right, your neighbor's family. I want to separate that family, right? I want to take the daughter away from this family. That's morally repugnant. If you had that idea, it would be morally repugnant. The practice of it, if you were actually to go ahead and do that, would be, well, inhumane and utterly cruel, right? You going into somebody's home and taking away their child, or taking the father away in chains and taking them away from their loved ones. The institutionalization of that practice, right? So there's this distinction. There's the idea, there's the practice, right, on an individual basis. But when you institutionalize that practice, well, that's pure evil in a way that is almost impossible to describe, and it certainly is beyond any rationalization. There is no rationalization under any circumstance that you can justify institutionalizing family separations, child incarcerations. And yet again, right, it is happening today here in the United States. It is something that we assume that, when we were going to school, that we read in history books, right, about civilizations that had descended into utter madness, right, that had committed great crimes against humanity. We've read about those governments, right? We've read about those civilizations, and we thought that was something that was well in the past, right? It's like that happened earlier on, as sort of, bless you, as we were evolving as a people. It happened in the 1930s and the 1940s. It happened during shameful periods here in this country as well, too. But we thought that was in the past. We said, there's no way that in 2017, 2016, the 2000s, that would be possible in a government that prides itself, right, in a country that prides itself in being a country built on a democracy, on a country built on immigration, a country built on the very foundation of families, that this would be happening today. And yet again, as I mentioned before, it is exactly what is happening in our country today. Today, in fact, more than 13,000 immigrant youth remain locked up in jail-like facilities across our country, unable to reconnect or be with their families and be with their loved ones because of our current immigration policies and practices. That's the reality today. Over 13,000 children today are locked up. I know our news cycle has moved away completely from that conversation, by and large, which is why we need to have the conversation we're having here today. We also know that We have a growing government deportation apparatus that is tearing at our families every day, tearing our families apart, and in fact, not only destroying our families, but also tearing the very fabric of this country in terms of its morals and its very values. That's been happening for a long time, not just the Trump administration, well before that as well, too, should mention that. And there's an even larger family separation crisis that looms around the corner. Our colleagues, my colleagues, are going to talk a little bit about, that piece, which is, as I think a lot of you know, TPS, and the ending of TPS for many of our brothers and sisters from Central America, from Haiti, and other parts of the world, and the devastation that will create for our communities. In fact, there are over 275,000 children, US-born mostly, that will be affected as a result of that decision by the Trump administration. That's coming right around the corner. Those are hundreds of thousands of families that are going to be torn apart. And so we are here today as a people, right, as American citizens or American residents, to say, ya basta, enough with family separations and incarcerations. That is not what we represent, not what we signed up for, if you will, right? It's not the way that we were raised. We are a people based completely on the notion of family unity. We are a country that should be very much based on that whole concept. And yet, this is happening in the country today, and we have to be able to say, no more. Despite the fact that media no longer is paying attention, we need to pay attention, or even I would say, let me rephrase that, we need to be paying more attention because media is not paying attention. Because media has moved on to the latest tweet from our idiot king. Media has moved on to, which NFL player is kneeling, which is, who is not, who likes the president, who doesn't like the president. That is what media is focused on, and yet as a community, our families are being torn apart. And so when I talked to Oscar Chacon, the executive director of Alianza Americas, a couple of months back, we were both obviously not fully surprised that media had sort of moved on from the crisis, the national crisis around family separation. But we thought it was really important for us to come together as a familia, right? As a family, as people of good conscience, to say, what can we do about this, right? What must we do about this? Right? Because what we know is that we cannot allow this to stand. We cannot allow this to stand. And in fact, when history books will be written, it will be who fought this, right? Who made sure that this ended in some form or fashion. And it is the very people in this room that have to be part of that story. It is the very people in this room and your allies and your friends and your families that have to be part of that narrative that says, enough. Right? We are not going to allow that to happen in our name, right? Because this ultimately still is our country. We are here. We have every right to make sure that we shape its future and its values and its morals. So in order to do that, we said we need to make sure that we're educated about the root causes of this crisis. Why is this happening, right? Oftentimes, we forget America's role in, the rest of the world, right? We forget in particular America's role in Central America, in the Caribbean, the years and decades of interventions in those countries, and how it's created this dynamic where people have had to been forced out of their homelands, right? Because the destabilization in our home countries has been often generated by American foreign intervention. So we are going to hear quite a bit about sort of, again, those root causes, and it is critical that we understand that in order to be able to better organize, to better resist, to better march, to better fight back, to better, again, make sure that this never happens, right, again. And so that is why we are here today, and I want to sort of end by saying again, thank you. Thank you for joining us today and prioritizing this in your life because we need your voices, we need your actions, and we need us, all of us, to affirm what matters most to us. And again, what matters most to all of us, with no exceptions, almost no exceptions, I don't think any exceptions. What matters most to us is family. It is the very sort of concept of, belonging, right? That connects us to everything that we do on a daily basis. So together we will say that we will never stop fighting this evil, if you will, of family separation and incarceration, and that together siempre se puede. Se puede, señores. Damas y caballeros, se puede. Sí se puede. Gracias. Now, I hope I sort of, again, gave you a little bit of a context about the conversation today. We have an amazing group of panelists that are here, and before I introduce my brother in arms, I do want to acknowledge that we do have the ambassador of El Salvador, the Ambassador Canjura is here joining us. Please give her a big round of applause. Thank you, Ambassador, for being here. And this fight is complicated, and it's going to require all of us, and all of us at different levels, right? Working with consulates, working with government, working with community advocates, working with the private sector, working with all different sectors to be able to, raise this to a level that I think people rise up and saying, we're going to vote these people out of office, but before we even vote these people out of office, we're going to make sure that this stops. So again, thank you again for being here. And now I have the privilege of introducing my brother, who, if we had studied hard enough, if we had money, we would have gone to George Washington University, but we are here today. So please, without further ado, Hector Sanchez, Executive Director of LCLAA.
Thank you, Jose, and thank you for leading a lot of these efforts and bringing us all together as a leader, but also with the great organization that you represent, Hispanic Federation. My name is Hector Sanchez. I'm the Executive Director of LCLAA, the Labor Council for Latin American Advancement. We are an organization that represents the interests of Latino, Latinas, and undocumented workers, Latinx workers. So we are in the front lines really fighting a lot of the labor rights of workers in the nation. And the issue that we're discussing today is a top priority for us because it's a labor rights issue, it's a human rights issue, and we should be embarrassed as a nation of how we're treating undocumented immigrants in the nation. We have a bubble of exploitation that our nation doesn't want to see, and we're abusing workers to a level that is unacceptable. I will compare this to the level of exploitation that I have seen in my work doing poverty work in developing nations. So it's a little bit of the conversation we're going to have today. Before I move in this direction, we have a Facebook Live. If you want to share this, want to make sure that the message that we're sharing today really goes to different spaces. We're trying to use all the different ways of organizing. We organize on the ground. We organize on social media. So if you to go to our website, LCLAA, or any of the websites of the great partners today, we have this event on Facebook Live, so it will be great if we can share, and if we can be tweeting and engaging in the conversation today. One of the big problems that I personally see in the nation on the issue of immigration is that it has focused solely on, particularly from the space that is attacking immigrants, on immigrants. As a nation, we have never or hardly ever look at the root causes of immigration. Like Jose say, we must take a responsibility as a nation on the issue of immigration. We're a hypocritical nation that decides not to grow up and blame everything on immigrants instead of really understanding why do we have so many undocumented immigrants in the nation. How do we explain that the richest nation in the world, that the nation that has the biggest military in the world, that has supposedly the biggest advances in technology in the world, that claims to be the best democracy in the world, how do we explain that this nation has 11 million undocumented workers in the nation? That is not a mistake. That is public policy. And we need to ask the question, who benefits from having 11 million undocumented workers in our nation, working in the fields, working in our hotels, working in our houses, working in so many spaces, and contributing so much, but not giving them a legal space or a line, everybody talks about the line, to really become part of our societies. Who benefits from having these 11 million undocumented workers in the nation? Trust me, not these workers. There are entire sectors of the economy that benefit from having a perfect system of exploitation, a perfect system of vulnerability for workers, a perfect system that evaporated the labor rights, the human rights, and the civil rights of these workers. It's a perfect system in which our workers live in constant fear. So if they raise their voices, they can be deported. That is why we have a perfect system of exploitation in the nation directly connected to the element of deportations. As I say, I travel all over the nation, and it's very common to see in industries in which undocumented workers are overrepresented, in the farm workers, in servicing, and the different industries. It's not hard to see the horrible stories of pain, the stories of a sister in the fields in Florida that is not, unfortunately, a unique case, where she was raped for 2 years in the fields because she was a single mother, undocumented, and she just wanted to take care of her children. Her supervisor was raping her for 2 years. When she had an injury, she didn't get paid, and she was always threatened that she was going to be deported if she raised her voice or if she tried to organize around her issues. I could tell you so many stories from the different fields on the industries of domestic workers, or sisters cleaning hotels, or sisters working in different areas that are contributing so much to our society. Unfortunately, it's not just one case. It's a pattern of stories that reflect the condition of these workers, and that's why we have a Trabajadoras campaign in the nation, because our undocumented sisters are the most vulnerable in the nation, the ones that have the highest levels of death and injuries at work. They have the highest levels of wage theft. Latinas have a wage theft of 53 cents for every dollar that a white male does for the same work. But for undocumented workers, it's really, really bad, to the point that it's sometimes hard to get the data, but we estimate that it may be in the 20 cents or close to 30 cents for the work that they are doing. So I think some of the elements of the conversation today is that we must change the national conversation and stop constantly blaming and focusing on immigrants, and take responsibility as a nation. And look at the root causes of immigration. As I say, we have addiction to cheap labor, and there are entire sectors of the economy that benefit from having these 11 million undocumented workers in the shadows. We all know I happen to be immigrant from central Mexico. In my state, in Guanajuato, every time I go, we see companies looking for people, literally, saying just get to California, get to Texas, get to Wisconsin, get to whatever state, and you have a job. Just make sure you get there. So it's an element of constant not recognizing that if this nation needs these workers, let's have a system that works for those industries, but also for the workers. Because so far, we have focused mostly on the one hand of what are the economic needs, but we don't focus on the workers. So our national addiction to cheap, exploitable, disposable labor is what is creating this system, and that's why we have 11 million undocumented workers. Another issue is that we're discussing today, the trade policies that the nation is negotiating with neighboring areas like NAFTA and CAFTA. It's very important that at this point, especially now that NAFTA, or the second part of NAFTA, has been negotiated, nobody is really looking at the impact that NAFTA had in related to immigration. After NAFTA was implemented in the first 6 years, immigration to the United States doubled. It literally devastated the Mexican countryside in agriculture in the nation, because it removed subsidies in the Mexican side. Mexico at the time depended 25% of the people over there work in agriculture, in comparison to 2.5 to 3% in the US. The difference is that in this context of free trade, the US didn't remove the subsidies, actually increased the subsidies for these industries. So farm workers in Mexico couldn't compete, so they either moved to the cities or to the maquilas, but mostly to the sectors in the US that were craving all these labor. So that's the second thing that is important to understand in terms of addiction to cheap labor, and also trade policies that create migration. Now, in terms of understanding the region of desestabilization, particularly Mexico and Central America, the two spaces that have the largest number of undocumented workers, we must also take responsibility as a nation for our addiction to drugs. Mexico and Central America are mainly the spaces providing the drugs that we are addicted to as a nation. We are the nation that consumes by far the largest number of drugs. And Mexico and Central America have been seriously destabilized when they're providing all these drugs to the US. And we have never took the analysis from that perspective, that we are a nation that is addicted to drugs and our neighbors are providing those drugs. So that's the responsibility point of view. Historically, and we have some of the great experts here, Oscar Chacon, talking about the US intervention in Latin America in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, literally opposing democratic values and democratic institutions in Latin America that sometimes imposed dictators that created a lot of instability in South America, Central America, and all this intervention also in Mexico historically created an element of immigration towards the United States. Now, in terms of the stabilization in neighboring countries, we should also talk about guns. What happens when most of the guns that go to Mexico also come from the United States, also from Central America? And also the final point that I wanted to mention is environmental issues and climate change issues. So I just wanted to put it in a perspective. I'm not going to get into all these different details, but the important part that we are discussing today, other than changing some of this analysis, some of this conversation, is what do we do? And the important part is we have been advocating a lot of, at a time when we're facing so many challenges, also opens new opportunities. And I believe, and I've seen all over the nation, people really wanted to engage on civic participation. So at a time when we're facing so many challenges, the Latino community, the immigrant community is embracing the most important elements of our democracy. And as an organization, we're doing voter registration, GOTV, voter education. People are engaging in the electoral process. So we're seeing a lot of the productive and the positive elements of all these spaces. And it's important to have this conversation, and today the panel is going to discuss something also related to what are the solutions, what are the next steps. With that, I want to, first of all, thank our great friends from the George Washington Cisneros Hispanic Leadership Institute for helping us put this event together and helping us open the doors to this great university. And I want to introduce the director, Elizabeth Vaquera, that is a great researcher on the issue of immigration, to give us some of her analysis on this issue of deportation. Muchas gracias.
Buenos días, good morning. Welcome to GW, and welcome on behalf of the Cisneros Hispanic Leadership Institute. I would like to start off today's forum by sharing a quote from sociologist Douglas Massey. Massey writes, "If one does not understand how a complicated piece of machinery works, one should not try to fix it. Without a clear picture of how a mechanical system functions, what its basic principles are, and how its various parts interconnect to influence one another, one is unlikely to be able to restore the machinery to health if it's not working well, or to modify it effectively if a different outcome is desired. Without a clear conception of how the various moving parts of the machine fit together to function as an integrated whole, one cannot readily predict how a change introduced in one part of the system will influence other parts to alter operation or affect outcomes. Blindly tinkering with a gear here or a cog there, or adding new levers and springs simply because they look good, is to invite a host of unintended consequences and perhaps to cause a calamity that no one expected or desired. It should come as no surprise that Massey, one of the most influential sociologists researching US-Mexico migration, uses this analogy to speak about the US immigration system. Throughout history, lawmakers have been tinkering with its different parts of this complex machine without fully understanding how it works or how moving one piece can drastically affect another. Lately, it feels that we just haven't been tinkering, but throwing in the whole wrench. I don't claim to be a mechanic when it comes to the immigration machine, but in addition to being the director of the Cisneros Hispanic Leadership Institute, I'm a sociologist. And as such, I'm trained to unpack complex systems. My research over the past 2 decades has looked at some of those unpredicted effects that are often left out of the conversation and the policies when we speak about immigrants. In particular, I've been studying the emotional health and well-being of immigrants, and in particular, immigrants of Latino origin and their families. To frame the conversation today that is going to follow, I would like to share 2 recent projects that I have worked on to expand how we think about immigrant families placed in this complicated machine here in the United States. Last November in 2007, my colleagues of the Milken School of Public Health and I collected data from over 200 Latino parents of adolescents. The goal was understanding the impact that recent immigration news and policies had on their health. What was novel about our study is that we looked at parents across different legal statuses: citizens, legal permanent residents, TPS, and undocumented. And what we found is that the changes in immigration policies had caused Latino families to report high levels of psychological distress, including symptoms of anxiety and depression. While it won't surprise anyone in this audience that the undocumented Latino parents had increased anxiety and depression related to changing policies of the current administration, what may surprise some is that all Latino parents showed increase regardless of their residency status. Yes, even parents who were citizens experienced these adverse effects, sometimes at the same level as undocumented parents. And with all that has happened since last November when we collected this data, it's only reasonable to expect that these effects have gotten worse. We found that these Latino families that we talked to, a majority of whom were documented in some form and legally living in the United States, often also avoided medical care or seeking public services that they were eligible for. They also often warned their children to stay away from the police. Their children, a majority of whom are United States citizens, thus are also negatively affected by their parents' anxiety and precariousness. Yes, immigration policies are harming the future and well-being of both immigrants and our own citizens. As this effect is not felt, and this effect is not felt just along the southern border, which is what is taking a lot of space in the media these days, our study actually focused on a large city in the mid-Atlantic that will remain no-named. In fact, while the summer of 2018 marked the beginning of physical separation of parents from children immediate to their arrival at the border, and as some have already mentioned earlier this morning, family separation has been part of the larger immigration machine for decades. This is the focus of another forthcoming article that I have co-authored with Dr. Elizabeth Aranda, not myself, but my colleague Elizabeth at the University of South Florida. This is part of the Immigrant Youth Project, a project of which we are co-PIs, and it's supported by the National Science Foundation. And in this project, we are interviewing undocumented young adults in Central Florida. Through in-depth interviews with over 50 undocumented Latino young adults living in Florida, most of these having DACA, in our research, we illustrate how undocumented youth experience the current deportation regime that puts them at risk of family separation long after they have crossed the border. Indeed, it's a reminder that programs like DACA essentially represent only a deferment of deportation in the current political climate. The news of these recent family separations signals a heightened deportability of undocumented immigrants. That is, the looming threat of family separation is now always on the horizon of these youth and their families, not just the ones now arriving at the southern border, but also those established across the United States. Much like we see with the Latino parents, these youth live in a heightened and all-encompassing fear about the possibility of family separation. This fear is felt across generations. It's multi-generational. One participant in our study recalled trying to calm crying children at the place she volunteered right after Trump got elected. When she asked why they were crying, the staff responded, well, Trump got inaugurated, so to them, their parents automatically got deported in their heads. Unfortunately, some of us know all too well how some parts of the machine work. The young adults we interviewed as part of this research fear for themselves, fear for their families. They view their lives as having expiration dates that coincide with the end of the DACA protection. They know that recent court decisions allowing for renewals still leave them in precarious positions because they can be taken away tomorrow by another court decision. Unfortunately, these fears are not unfounded. Anti-immigrant discourse and xenophobia are the principles behind the current administration's executive orders and policies. His administration has severely reduced annual caps on refugee and asylum admissions, and it's going to go further down. They have announced the fast approaching end dates for the temporary protected status for Nicaraguans, Hondurans, Salvadorans, and Haitians that are coming just in a few months. They have announced plans to remove citizens for immigrants who they are deemed to use fraudulent methods in the process of becoming naturalized. They have proposed regulations to deny permanent residency and possibly deport persons who use certain public services. They are denying U.S. passport to citizens along the southern border. They are proposing changes to the public charge rule. And of course, the summer executive order resulting in the separation of children from their parents in the U.S.-Mexico border. Today's forum is so crucial, but allow me to end on a positive note. In both of these studies, grassroots efforts from their own communities and immigrant rights organizations proved to be an important positive outlet in the life of these immigrants. I'm so incredibly heartened and hopeful to see everyone in this room and all the efforts that are being made outside of the administration. As the panelists speak this morning, I want to encourage all of us to think about how immigrant family unity is much bigger than one policy and is not an isolated event in one place or one time. Let's imagine today what it means to look at the whole machine as we see immigrants not as a problem to be fixed, but as an integral part of our country. Thank you. So now it's time to transition for the strategic discussion that is going to focus on challenges and solutions to this critical issue of immigration. So to moderate the panel, I would like to welcome Laura Esquivell, the Director of National Advocacy of the Hispanic Federation. Laura.
Thank you for ending on a positive note, Elizabeth. Very hard to do given the topic. I'd like to invite the panelists to join me up here. One, two, three, four. So thank you again, everybody, for coming. My name is Laura Esquivell. I'm the Director of National Advocacy for Hispanic Federation. I lead our federal advocacy efforts here in Washington, D.C. We're very, very happy to see you all, and to those of you on Facebook, hey. So we are entering October with about 350 children still separated from their families under Trump's zero-tolerance border policy, instead of reunited with their parents as ordered by the court. Nearly 2/3 of those children's parents have been deported without their children. The country, not just immigrants and immigrant advocates, were outraged when they saw these separations happening at the border, and rightly so. People across the country spoke up. They marched, they protested, they got arrested, and it made a difference. But these are not the only families being threatened and torn apart by Trump administration immigration policies. There is, of course, the uncertainty still hanging over 800,000 DACA recipients, many with young children, whose status is currently protected only by a court order. We must add to all of these families those broken up every day by deportation actions. Some people who just show up for their annual check-ins, as they've been doing for years, and get taken into custody and deported, some without even being given a chance to say goodbye to their family members. Others leaving behind businesses they've worked years to build. And workplace raids, like a recent one at a slaughterhouse in eastern Tennessee that arrested nearly 100 workers, pulling breadwinners from their families and sending shockwaves through the quiet rural community. ICE announced very proudly this summer that it had doubled the number of raids over the year before, as they worked to meet their goal of quadrupling the rate of the previous administration's workplace raids. In the 6 months ending in May of this year, about 3,500 worksite investigations from raids were opened compared to 1,700 for the entire 2017 fiscal year. While the administration and its supporters praise these events and these goals, residents and families left in the communities impacted are largely left to pick up the pieces on their own. In the aftermath of these sorts of raids and deportations, the community response is like what we see following a natural disaster. The community hosts fundraisers to help the families with food and money. Volunteers show up to help people deal with the trauma. People try to figure out how to not lose their homes while they wait for the courts to decide what is going to happen to their loved ones. For schools, administrators are faced with convincing students that it's safe to go to class. As many as 550 students did not show up to school the day after the slaughterhouse raid. And thousands of children across this country are worried when they say goodbye to their parents every morning that they might not be there to pick them up at the end of the day. But these are not natural disasters. These are man-made. The nearly 13,000 migrant children who came across the border alone who are still detained rather than placed with family members or sponsors, as more and more sponsors are afraid to come forward for fear of being deported themselves, represent a 5-fold increase from a year ago. Now we are facing potentially the largest mass separation of children from their immigrant parents this country has ever seen. 1 in 4 children in the U.S. live with an immigrant parent or has an immigrant parent, and more than 270,000 U.S.-born children have a parent with TPS, the majority of whom are faced with losing that status next year in 2019. Let that sink in for a minute. There are more than 270,000 U.S.-born children who have a parent with TPS who are faced with losing that protection next year. Children with parents from El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, Haiti, and much smaller numbers from Nepal and war-torn countries like South Sudan, Somalia, Syria, Yemen, will soon be forced to choose. Stay here or go in the shadows undocumented. Stay here and go in the shadows undocumented. Leave their homes, communities, and jobs and take their children and families to unstable and potentially dangerous situations, or leave by themselves, leaving their families, their jobs, and their homes behind. What would you do? What would you do when faced with that decision about your family, about your children? Would you leave them behind? The first group to have to make that decision will be Nicaraguans, whose TPS status runs out in just a few months in January. But all of these families are struggling now with making those decisions and trying to decide what they're going to do. Today, we're going to hear from a range of panelists, policy experts, service providers, and individuals who will help us better understand what is around the corner, how did we get here, and what can we do to fight back, besides vote, of course. I'm going to introduce our panelists, but we will make sure there's plenty of time for questions and discussions after the brief presentations. Our first panelist is Oscar Chacon. He's the co-founder and executive director of Alianza Americas. Alianza is an umbrella of immigrant-led and immigrant-serving organizations based in the U.S. Alianza is dedicated to improving the quality of life within Latino immigrant communities in the U.S. as well as throughout the Americas. Oscar has served in multiple advisory committees to national and international processes, including the civil society consultation processes associated with the Global Forum on Migration and Development and World Social Forum in Migration. Oscar is a frequent national and international spokesperson on transnationalism, economic justice, the link between migration and development, immigration policies, and the U.S. Latino community issues. Welcome, Oscar. I'm going to just introduce everybody, and then we'll circle back. Our second speaker is Abel Nuñez, who's the Executive Director of the Central American Resource Center, CARECEN, and has been in that role for the past 15 years. Six years. Well, it seems like you've been leading it a long time. Since 1981, CARECEN has provided a wide range of services for the Washington, D.C. Latino population, including legal assistance, housing counseling, citizenship education, and community economic development. CARECEN also promotes grassroots empowerment, civic engagement, and civil rights advocacy. Abel was the 2017 recipient of Georgetown's John Thompson Jr.'s Legacy of a Dream Award, presented last year at the Kennedy Center. Congratulations on that, Abel. Our third speaker is Gerardo Sanchez. Our third speaker is Gerardo Sanchez. He's the owner and CEO of Así es mi gente television based here in Washington, D.C. Mr. Sanchez arrived in 2001 from El Salvador. He is a TPS holder, here with his 4 daughters. 2 of those daughters currently have DACA, which, as we know, makes their status precarious as well. And thank you for coming. And our last speaker on the panel is Nancy Santiago Negron. Nancy is the Vice President of Strategic Partnerships and Communications at Hispanics in Philanthropy. HIP partners with a transnational network of foundations to make impactful investments in Latino communities and works to help Latino nonprofits access funds and develop their leadership so they can effectively address the most pressing issues facing our communities. And boy, do we need the involvement of the philanthropic community in this fight. Nancy served 2 terms in the Obama administration, was instrumental in designing and executing key public policy and federal programs. Her work has been focused on aligning capital with justice and racial equity. And Nancy's received numerous awards, too many to mention here, actually. There's a long list of them, but including the Women of Distinction Award from El Diario La Prensa, New York's largest Spanish-language newspaper. Thank you, Nancy, for joining us. We're going to kick off the panel with Oscar talking about the historic transnational roots of migration, why we pull our roots, and how that pushes us towards migration. Thank you, Oscar.
Thank you very much, Laura. Can you hear me all right? Good. Well, in addition to what was mentioned about me, I was born and raised in El Salvador. So I'm an immigrant from one of the countries that has become fairly popular under the rubric of the so-called Northern Triangle countries, which, by the way, we never used, in Central America. That nomenclature is entirely U.S.-made. But let me begin by pointing out that by the late 1970s, Central American countries were among the most impoverished nations in the world. And pay attention, I'm not saying poorest countries, I'm saying impoverished nations. Because wealth was being generated, just like it is being generated now. We have billionaires in Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, and that's why I'm talking about impoverishment as opposed to poverty. But not only did we suffer of chronic impoverishment, which essentially meant profound economic inequality. It also meant severe social exclusion, where kids were constantly dying of gastrointestinal disease. And it also meant a severe lack of democracy, meaningful democracy that makes people care about. We had elected governments, but they were, for all practical purposes, dictatorships. I'm laying this out because I was asked to provide a bit of a historical perspective, and I'm not going to go into all of the details. Suffice to say, the way before Central Americans were finding their way to the US, which began pretty much in the 1980s, we were suffering already with severe problems. Problems that have not necessarily been overcome over the last 4 decades. These problems are still present, and they explain why so many people come in addition to new problems that we have faced since the late 1970s. The 1980s and the 1990s, many of you here may not remember, but the United States of America adopted a very significant change in refugee asylum policies, precisely on that year, 1980. And in many ways, Central Americans who were just beginning to come in large numbers to the US, particularly from Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Guatemala. There wasn't much Honduran migration back then. But these countries, and particularly Guatemala and El Salvador, were actually seen in many ways as guinea pigs with whom to test the new asylum refugee policies just adopted in 1980. In theory, the change meant that these people, based on the fear of persecution they experienced, should be able to receive political asylum in the US. Yet, if you go back and look at the statistics, in as far as how many Guatemalans, Salvadorians were actually granted political asylum in the 1980s, you will shockingly find that throughout the 1980s, the rate of approval for these two nationalities never went beyond 3%. In spite of the well-documented evidence that would suggest that these people should have received protection in the form of political asylum. Many of those people indeed applied for political asylum, but were denied, appeals were filed, and children began to be detained as early as the 1980s. How many of you are familiar with Jenny Lisette Flores? Anybody here knows who that young woman was back in the 80s? Was a Salvadorian minor who became the reason why we have the so-called Flores Settlement Agreement. Okay? Because she was detained for a long period of time in 1985. That case was fought by the American Civil Liberties Union, and it did not translate into any obligation to the US government until 1997, when then Attorney General Reno finally agreed to codify how children should be treated when in detention. And that's the very agreement that our current Attorney General is trying to basically trash, because it stipulates that no minor should ever be held for longer than a few weeks, and even if they have to be detained, they cannot be detained in a jail. They have to be detained in a very clearly different setting. Well, that agreement has been violated, as a matter of fact, not only by this administration, and there have been indeed renewed attempts to hold the US federal government accountable on these changes. Let me also remind you, as another critical piece of history, that in the 1980s and 90s, when you put them together, we did have a very significant legalization program that was built into the 1986 immigration policy reform. Most people only remember the so-called amnesty, It was not an amnesty. Just in case anybody's wondering, there has never really been an amnesty, for undocumented immigrants in the U.S. in recent times. An amnesty is a unilateral decree of pardonness, where the people who are intended beneficiaries have to do nothing to get the benefit. That's an amnesty. That's very different than what happened in 1986. But about 3.2 million people went through that legalization program and eventually were able to obtain legal permanent residency. Guess where most people who got that benefit had come from? Does anybody have a guess? What country was the largest beneficiary?
Canada?
No. Mexico! Come on, people. Mexicans were the largest beneficiaries of that legalization program. By the late 1980s, when you combine that single event, with other larger changes happening in the country, having to do mainly with the very economic system that we have been nourishing ever since, we were already having a lot of angry white people, to be honest with you. So the very moment in which what we are dealing with today really began to be articulated in recent history was in the late 80s, early 90s. A narrative was devised that essentially painted newcomers as outright undesirables, communists, rapists, thieves, killers. That is the narrative that began to be set in motion, as I said, as of the late 1980s. Somebody like Stephen Miller was a little kid, if he was born at the time, okay? But he is the absolute heir of those ideas. Again, set in motion that era. In 1994, you may remember, an election in California, where for the first time, these fears against the newcomers were successfully combined with electoral politics. And a dying re-election campaign turned into a winning campaign, whereby Pete Wilson secured re-election in California. But they also passed, in case you don't remember, the first ever big-time anti-immigrant ballot initiative, Proposition 187. Many of my colleagues believe at the time that we had successfully defeated Proposition 187 because we did get the federal court to put injunctions on most of the contents of that particular ballot initiative. But in reality, it came back in increased force. And in 1996, we passed the most horrible U.S. immigration policy. And let me be perfectly honest. That was not just a Republican Congress taking action. There were many Democrats who actually were part of that. And it was adopted under a Democratic administration, in case we don't remember. So all these elements are crucial to understand if we are to successfully then make sense of what are we dealing with today. Another event, pretty much put together in California, is something called 3 strikes and out. Some of you may remember it has more to do with criminal justice, but it meant that in the 1990s, many kids who had come as people seeking asylum in the US with their kids had to work 2 or 3 jobs to make ends meet and still help their families back home. And that reality led to many of those young kids to become involved with youth gangs in Los Angeles. I was a teenager in El Salvador in the late 1970s. We never ever had a gang problem in El Salvador. That problem was the result of massive deportation of young people involved in criminal activities as part of gangs in Los Angeles that were then sent back to El Salvador, to Guatemala, and to some degree to Honduras. So the point I'm making is that some of the violence of today is not even something that really germinated in these countries. It is something that we in the US exported, to those countries. Now, am I suggesting that gang violence is the only problem we have? Not at all. Keep in mind that in the 1980s we had severe conflicts, civil wars. The value of human life was severely devaluated, in our country. If of anything I am surprised, going back to these countries all the time nowadays, is that frankly, given what we went through in the 1980s and early 90s, the violence, as bad as it is, could be a lot worse, simply because of the trauma that we went through in the 1980s. Now, let me fast forward quickly because I have to wrap it up too. I already went beyond 10 minutes, and I said I was going to try to speak only 10 minutes, but let me just finish with these ideas. Today, what drives so many people out of their countries is indeed the pervasive state of safety that people experience in their own neighborhoods. In El Salvador, in Honduras, in Guatemala, which sadly compete today among the worst places to be in outside from active war conflicts around the world. El Salvador and Honduras usually compete to who's going to be top among the 5 most impacted nations in the world in terms of homicidal rates. And yes, there have been improvements, especially in the case of El Salvador, but the improvements are relative. If we were terribly high 2 years ago and we went down 15%, 20%, 30% in 1 year to the other, looks good, but it is still pretty bad in terms of homicidal rates. But on top of that violence, which I also have to say is not just gangs, we still have problems with police forces that go out of control and abuse their power and often commit criminal activity against their own population. That's part of the reality that is pushing people out. But we have not overcome systemic poverty. That is also part of the equation. And sometimes, we get lost into this idea, these are economic migrants, these are people fleeing violence. It's pretty fictitious of a difference. And it's one mainly designed to satisfy standards that we have been setting. But in reality, I don't know anybody running from violence that isn't also experiencing economic hardship. They go hand in hand. And it is important for us to understand that when we say that human rights are being violated systematically in many of these countries, I am never talking about people having the right to stay alive. I'm talking about people's economic, social, cultural, political rights being systematically violated. All of those are human rights. Not just the right to be alive and pursue, a decent way of life for you and your family. So let me just end by saying that there is hope in this fight, but not necessarily because of what our government would do. The hope I see is the ability for people like us to use every connection that we can and take these conversations to every worship place we can, take this conversation to every community organization we can, take this conversation to every place of study, beginning with high schools and forward, that we can, because the more we can tell this story, to Americans, not just in the places we are comfortable, like New York City, Boston, Chicago, Washington, D.C., but the hard places where we really need to take this conversation. That's where I believe hope lies. Because I still believe to this day, after nearly 4 decades residing in this country, that most Americans mean well. Most Americans would do the right thing if we are able to properly challenge their emotional assumptions and their misinformation that they are exposed to on a daily basis. Thank you.
Make sure it's turned on.
All right, so, well, can you hear me? All right. So thank you everybody for being here. So I just want to make a couple of points sort of from the perspective of a local service provider. As we serve the community that's coming in. One, sort of the big picture that there's this belief, in the American dream, and that people are coming into this nation to fulfill it, right? To seek it out. But there is sort of the country of origins nightmare that people are fleeing. And another notion is that when we talk about immigration, it is discussed as if it's something that the U.S. is a passive victim that it happens to. As if that country of origin nightmare, the U.S. did not have their hands in it, right? Their ability to have impact and influence in those countries of origin. So when Oscar was talking about sort of the conflicts of the 1980s, let's not forget that the U.S. invested about $1 million a day in military aid for 12 years, and there are consequences to that, right? And so the U.S. has a moral responsibility to figure out how to protect the victims of that violence, independent of which side they came in. And so, but throughout the last 30 years, what has quietly happened is a legal framework that works against the protection of individuals seeking refuge. And as the flow of immigrants has been changing from primarily Mexican adults seeking employment, that you can very well see are seeking an American dream, right? And it sort of plays well to that narrative, to one that you have Central Americans, family units, looking for refuge. That doesn't really go well for the narrative. And so then they have to be illicit actors coming in, a danger to the security of this nation, something that has to be protected against. And so that is the environment in which, unfortunately, the people that I serve walk through, and they have nothing to say on that narrative, nothing to say in those conditions. They try to mitigate it, right? And so I think that's important. The other thing, as we're talking about immigrants, so much of the time and so much of the discussions is talked about in general terms. The families at the border, the immigrant flows. But this has a name. Central America. 3 nations. So we need to understand that perspective, because it's where the piece where we need to connect U.S. foreign policy to that particular region, together with our domestic policy on immigration protection, to really then develop appropriate interventions that will really help and support and protect the people that are sort of the victims of all this. And just to sort of highlight that, Oscar talked about the Flores Accord. It was a Salvadorian young woman. He also mentioned about the asylum cases that Central Americans were winning at a 3% rate. Although when you look at it, it was Guatemalans and Salvadorians, Nicaraguans were getting approved at almost a 90% rate. But if you remember who was being supported by whom, and who was the enemy of the U.S. at that particular time. But then, action was taken. We have the ABC class, which eventually led to TPS law to protect them, which eventually led to the Nicaraguan and Central American Adjustment Act. You know, I think most recently, we can see the crisis of the unaccompanied minors in 2014. They were not minors from all over the world. They were not even minors from all over Central America. They were minors from 3 countries that were coming in, right? You know, President Obama called it a humanitarian crisis. We just had the recent caravan where our current president sent the National Guard to the border to protect us from primarily Honduran families coming in seeking refuge. And the most recent Attorney General's decision to really eliminate domestic violence as an ability to provide credible fear for asylum cases, that was a Salvadoran woman, right? So let's name it appropriate. I think we need to call it in its appropriate name so that we can truly begin to discuss what are the appropriate solutions moving forward. You know, I've had the opportunity to meet with Secretary Nielsen just before the decisions on TPS for the Central American countries and Haiti. And by and large, you know, what was interesting is that this administration has not, you know, signed new laws. It is using the existing legal framework, right? What did they tell us when we met with them? You know, Secretary Nielsen was very clear. It is, we are bound by the legislation that was approved by Congress. Because from their perspective, the only reason that they could extend TPS was if the conditions by which the original TPS was given still persisted in the country of origin. So they did not take into account the current conditions. By the way, we now know that the sort of in-country apparatus of the U.S. government was telling them to extend TPS. So they did not even listen to their own advisors on the ground. But they did limit the scope in their interpretation of the law to get to a decision that basically ended TPS. The interesting thing was that she, you know, the secretary rightly pointed out that the only way to truly solve this is to go to Congress. You know, she even actually committed to lobby with us and join us in our efforts. Unfortunately, to date, I have not received a call from her to join us. Maybe after the midterms, we'll get a call, but, you know, we would welcome her to help us do that. But I do think that there are other messages that are very troublesome. You know, I've heard Director Cisna from USCIS, as he talks about the elimination of this program, says, well, they can apply for something else. You know, there are other mechanisms that they can do. And it is partially true, because the original, when you look at the Salvadorian case, the original group of people that were protected were around 275,000. The current number is somewhere around 190. And throughout the years that they've been in the program, people have found ways to actually adjust. But if it were that easy, the entire class by now would have become legal permanent residents. And so that what this administration is doing, as they're telling everybody else they can apply for something else, they are making sure that those avenues get closed, right? So the asylum route is going to get closed. Our estimates are that for the TPS, about 20% will probably have a mechanism to adjust, either through family petition, work, labor certification, or the other limited means that exist out there. Another 20%, once they lose their protection, because they have previous orders of deportation, are going to be truly vulnerable. Because if they do find themselves in front of ICE, they will be detained and they will be deported. They've lost their ability to you know, they've already gone through their legal process. But then the large majority really don't have anything. An avenue that we were exploring at CARECEN was, you know, petitioning for asylum, because these group of people are going to be targets when they get to their country of origin. But of course, you know, the Attorney General has limited our ability and has erased about 20 years of legal precedence in the way people are protected. So I think that we have to think about, have a sort of long game and a short game. And I say this because as we're getting ready for a midterm elections, everybody's talking about, oh, yes, we need to change sort of who is in office to get sort of better legislators that then will, you know, pass laws that will make it better for this community. But the reality is, under the best of circumstances, you know, that's not gonna be a quick fix, right? And, starting in January, then July, and then September, we'll have the bulk of people under TPS lose their protection. That means that they're susceptible to being picked up by ICE and put in deportation proceedings. They will also lose their ability to work legally in this country. And that means that, and everything that comes along with them, getting driver's license, opening up, sort of financial instruments, banking accounts, checking accounts, for those that have licenses. So many of TPS members, for example, like in the Houston area, work in the ports, and they have commercial driver's licenses. Well, those goes out the door. Not only do they lose their driver's license, but they lose their ability to earn a living. And so I think that those are the things that we have to do, because the short game is about how do we protect the individuals, right? Because what I want to be able to do is to provide an answer to the TPS member from El Salvador that will come in October 1st and tell me, what can you do for me? And I can't tell him, well, we did a great job in November. That's not going to protect them in their day-to-day. That's not going to make sure that they can drive legally. And we're lucky that some of the states and municipalities are actually being pretty good about providing mechanisms so that you can integrate all of the residents into their communities. Some of them are providing actually resources to ensure that the field, the advocates and the legal providers have the financial resources to scale it up and make sure that we can offer some individualized protection. But the reality is that when TPS ends, and even when DACA ends, and although that we're fighting it in the courts, because our friend are the courts at this moment, they're the ones holding the line, but all of those cases are not challenging the executive's power to terminate the programs, right? With TPS, we have 5 cases right now in the courts. I don't know how many DACA cases exist, and there are injunctions, and we're happy for some of the injunctions. But what those suits are challenging is in the way they acted upon terminating the status. Was it racial? And for some of them, the harm that it will do to the U.S.-born children of TPS members. But it doesn't really challenge the underlying legal framework, right? And so I think that's why we need to be clear about where we're moving forward in terms of the long game and the short game. So I sort of try to, I live in one, but I know the importance of existing in both. As an organization that provides direct legal services, our responsibility is to ensure that we have the capacity and increase our capacity to serve as many people that need our services. But that is not going to do it, because we won't be able to build a big enough net. We're not going to be able to develop enough lawyers, legal providers to cover everyone. And I think that the example of losing TPS, losing DACA, we really can clearly see the difference between policies that provide a collective protection versus now that we're going to need our individualized protections, which is in the courts, fighting it out. Our sort of challenge is, as much as we have increased our capacity in the field, it is still not enough. You can go to all the service providers, and most of them will tell you, we're at capacity. We're at capacity. We can't take one more client, right? And the nature of how immigration system works, some of these cases are in the system for a very long time. And I'll give you like a clear example. One of the things that we were promoting was an asylum strategy, right? Particularly for the TPS that don't fall into that 20% that may have a family connection or work connection, or that 20% that really are really vulnerable because they already went through a legal process. And we were thinking, well, how would this work? To the extent that we can create mechanisms for people to do pro se affirmative applications, we know that the majority of them, even if they're good, credible cases, will probably be denied at the administrative level. And so they'll be referred to court. At that point, we know for a fact that people that enter into court without legal representation have about a 90 to 95% chance of losing their case, right? Even having legal representation only gives you a 60% chance of winning it, but it's better than 90% lose rate. And so the challenge for us as a community organization is how do we increase our capacity? How do we bring in resources to the field so that we are staffing up now, not in September when the lines are going to be out around the corner from my office, people desperately seeking, what do I do now? You know, and yes, when you have particularly a community that has developed roots because they have been here legally, not permanently, but nonetheless in legal, been able to work legally, travel, and now to be forced with a decision, either I go back to a country that may not be ready to integrate me, or stay here and figure out how to return back into the shadows, knowing full well that they have lived in the light for 20 years. So they've registered and with multiple government agencies, they have their life structured around being with the legal status. And so I think our role is twofold. One, how do we ensure that we are protecting as many immigrants as we can and ensuring that we fix them permanently for them individually, but also connecting with organizations in the country of origin for those either that decide to return back or two that are going to be forced to go back, to make sure that their integration is sort of the most optimal that it can be. Now, whether those individuals then make a personal decision to return, that's a separate conversation. But in a minimum, our role is to make sure that that transition is as smooth as possible. I mean, think about just the logistics of this. If you have a house, you sell a house, you know, I tell people, let's say you sell your house, you sell your business, and you know, you can't just take like $30,000 in your pocket, get on a plane, and go back to El Salvador. It just doesn't work that way, right? There are really complicated mechanisms of transferring monies and wealth. You know, simple things as school records, health records, job recommendations that people need to have in order when they're going to start a new life. And how does that translate to the country of origin? How do they live there, particularly if they were young when they came and they need all the documentation? You know, how does someone get a driver's license in El Salvador, in Guatemala, that has not lived there or been in that nation for a while? All intended purposes, they only know how the U.S. system works. But I do want us to always be cognizant of that as we're thinking about strategies of protection, it can't just be an electoral strategy in the long game, but it also needs to include a short game of individualized protection. So I want to end my remarks in terms also sort of in a positive sort of frame, that's saying that this has provided us an incredible opportunity to really coalesce around the protection of these individuals that brings together multiple partners, from the religious community to the legal service providers to municipalities, right? So we need to take advantage of our local elected officials, for those that are like-minded, to educate them so that they put in policies in place that help integrate immigrants. But secondly, and I think very importantly, for them to also put forth resources, financial resources, so that the organizations that are providing these services can scale up, and that we can connect and develop the best network possible. It won't be perfect, we won't be able to capture anyone, but we will be able to then increase our capacity to serve. This also means partnering with the countries of the region. You know, I'm originally from El Salvador as well, and I'm really happy because the government of El Salvador, in its attempt, has created a fund to protect its nationals outside of El Salvador. And we're working with them to see, well, how can they channel that money so that it has the greatest impact for protection of their nationals. So my goal, and I'm happy that Nancy is here, to talk about how do we get, you know, the foundations, municipalities, governments of the region to really come together to begin creating the network necessary to provide that individualized protection. And also, hopefully, that also allows more people to come into the space that can allow for that long game to put in place not just policies, but the legal framework where all of the immigration law is embedded in, that is limiting, exclusionary, right, and favors people that look like the dominant class. So I'll end my comments there, and I'll turn it over to the next guy.
Make sure it's on. Oh. There we go. Actually, I'm going to follow the resource comments. I think that makes sense, right? So,
The connection.
yeah, it makes some sense there. And so Hispanics in Philanthropy has been involved in this conversation because as a network of philanthropic organizations and individual philanthropists, we not only serve as the conscience of philanthropy, and if you think about it, philanthropy is about the love for humanity. And there's nothing more inhumane than what's happening now. So we were challenging philanthropic organizations to get in this conversation, even if and when they don't fund in the countries of origin that we're talking about. There is a way to impact what's happening. So Hispanics in Philanthropy has done a few things, and I'll talk about all of them, but back to the resource conversation, we knew we needed to focus the philanthropic sector on this issue. Their attention was on it. Folks were calling, they didn't know what they could do, right? So we could give money, but to whom and for what? So not understanding the system and quite honestly, the reasons for why we're seeing what we're seeing made it very hard for them to step in and figure out how they helped. So we, back in August, and Abel formed a part of this, did a delegation of some of the country's biggest philanthropic leaders, and we went to the Tijuana border. And so our goal was to get not just philanthropy, the folks that writing the checks, but also the organizations that receive some of the dollars like CARECEN and other organizations to be there to help challenge the philanthropic sector on the narratives that they've heard, force them to see the situation in its full scale, meaning the reasons for these migratory issues that we're seeing across the Americas, getting them also to see the United States' responsibility in what's happening right now. So our delegation was there 2.5 days, and there were a few things that we saw, and I wanted to move you into some of those things because I think it's really important for us to help you understand how you bring people that aren't part of this conversation in, how you teach them, how you talk to them. So part of what we did was help them see the tools that are being used to, quite honestly, hurt families who are in vulnerable situations to begin with. We help them understand the damaging language and narratives that are being used and have been developed for decades to villainize and demonize migrants who, quite honestly, are coming here for all intents and purposes because of the problems we as a country have created there in their land of origin. So as the first thing was challenging the narrative. The next big thing that we did is we forced them to look at how we're using our own legal system to harm people. And it's really important that you understand that some of it are policies and some of it we're actually using our court systems to create damage. So to give you a very specific example, Operation Streamline is a series of, basically a system of court processes that have been put in place in the city of San Diego to quickly move people through the process. They call it Streamline because it's supposed to be alleviating the burden on the courts. What it's doing is moving people in such a fast pace that they do not have access to legal services. They do not have access to a meal or food or change of clothing. They're being dehumanized, they're being held, and they're being dumped in front of a judge who basically gives them no options except to be criminalized with a misdemeanor. They don't get a chance. Once you're criminalized, by the way, and you have a misdemeanor on your record, not only do you not have entry back into the country, you also don't qualify for your asylum hearings. You no longer have that as an access point. So we're bringing people in, even if they're coming in through legal ports of entry to claim asylum, and they're being held in these court systems and commingled with people who are trying to enter illegally. So there's a bunch of things that are happening there. And that's just one example of how the legal system is being used to criminalize immigrants and to make sure they have no way to return afterward. So that's just one example. We also got to see while we were out there a detention facility. And so very interesting to see what's happening there. Again, no access to legal services. Families who are in the area that could potentially help the person that's being held and detained, those detainees are being moved to other states, breaking them away from the only support system that they have. So they're being moved around the country where they have yet less access to help and support services. Another way that we're keeping people from being able to advocate for themselves. Even if you just talk about the family separation piece, we start to move into the cloudy world between the legal system and policies that are being put in place. So once people are removed and sent, let's say, to Tijuana, and by the way, they're not all Spanish speakers, so we have Haitian refugees, we have Pakistani women fleeing domestic violence situations. We've taken away their ability to claim asylum. We criminalize them. We send them back to a country that they came in through, but they don't speak the language. So I have an entire community of Haitian refugees stuck in Tijuana, in limbo. I have women from other countries who don't speak Spanish or English completely stuck in a situation without their children now, many times. So to be able to even get their families back, their children back, these women are waiting in these shelters to be able to fulfill all the requirements we place upon them to get their children back. What's really interesting, and it was interesting to show philanthropic leaders, is those mothers and fathers are being asked to comply with the same requirements we require of U.S. citizens when we take your children away for abuse cases. When we sever parental rights in this country for a parent who's been accused of abuse or neglect, you have to establish, you have to do parenting classes, you have to do blood work to prove that you're not a drug or alcohol substance user. You have to be able to establish a residence and have it fully furnished, and you have to have a job. That's all before you can even attempt to get your parental rights reinstated. We're holding these immigrants that have come through our borders to that same standard. You don't speak the language, you're not from the country, you're living in a homeless shelter on the other side of the border. How could you possibly fulfill all those requirements? But we haven't changed the policy to match the situation. So these are the tools that are being used, almost weaponized in a way, to hurt families and to criminalize them. So we had to get philanthropic leaders to see these pieces. So Abel and folks that came with us were helping untangle, for folks who don't know the system, all the tools that are being used to kind of keep this happening. I think that one of the really important things to keep in mind in all of this is that we're also using our own industries in this country to facilitate these processes. So I don't know if you guys have been following Bank of America. Bank of America is arbitrarily shutting down and freezing accounts for people they think are undocumented. They will freeze the assets. So you can have a Latino surname and maybe have no real connection to Bank of America other than maybe you have a, I'm trying to think of the case of a young Cuban man who has a production company. The name of his company was the Cuban Missile. Right? He was nicknamed. He was a baseball player when he was young. That was his nickname. That was the name of his company. They thought there was something wrong with that. They shut all of his assets down. He's a U.S. citizen. But he came in as, back then, a refugee status, and so they just arbitrarily shut him down. It took him months to get his assets back. So we're even using the legal system, policies, and industry to create this broken, to further exacerbate the situation and feed upon this already broken immigration system. So our delegation brought folks together to get them to see these things, and then to get them, in their own estimation, figure out what they can do from a resource perspective to impact a part of the system. So as a result of the delegation, for instance, and this is just an example, one of the foundations, which by the way has nothing to do with any of these issues, they are a health foundation. They are a health-focused organization. They still figured out a way to support, at least in San Diego, some of the shelters that were absorbing families. So they figured out that even though we don't do any type of philanthropic giving in this space, we can support the organizations that are taking in families. So, being able to write a check for $600,000 to a small organization that's trying to house people that have no place to go is a big deal. Being able to bring the YWCAs of America with us on this trip, they were able to think about, we have real estate in this country, we can take in mothers and children. So if we provide them an address, we give them an opportunity to have their asylum cases heard. We heard an asylum case, by the way, in a detention center where the only reason the young woman was not given asylum is that she basically had no address in the U.S. to go to. That's where the YWCA stands up and says, we'll give her an address. She was a young woman from Nepal, had come in through the San Diego border, didn't have a translator, didn't have any kind of legal support, and she was denied asylum. And we were pretty certain, the legal team that was watching the case, that she's a victim of trafficking. So she was coming and seeking asylum. So these are some of the things that we're trying to show philanthropic leaders. In addition to the delegation that we did, and I'm happy to share notes with folks from what we learned on that visit, where we identified some of the tools that are being used in the legal system, policies, and quite honestly, questionable behaviors on behalf of municipalities in some cases, and in organizations and others that are trying to continue to feed this system of criminalizing immigrants. We have also partnered with Camina, which is the Central American and Mexican Alliance, Migration Alliance. This network of organizations, 38 of them that exist along the migration corridor in Latin America, all the way up through Mexico and the US borders, is a group of organizations that are trying to address the systemic roadblocks. Those roadblocks in existing countries like violence, like poverty, like femicide, that are moving people out of their countries and coming into this country for safety and support. We're trying to address everything from the labor practices to protection of women in domestic violence situations. So Camina is attempting to look at the causes, the root causes, but you can't look at those root causes and not see the US's hand in it. So part of the work that we're doing with Camina as well is trying to kind of hold the United States systems and practices and organizations that have fed those practices accountable for our role in this. So Camina is another way that we're attempting to both change the narrative and change the realities for people on the ground in their countries of origin. But additionally, we have established, after this delegation, a family unity fund. And part of that family unity fund, all of the different delegation representatives that came that are philanthropic organizations are giving money in. But what we want to look at is not just the immediate response, because we do need to focus on that, but to Abel's point, it's the long-term impact. What happens to the communities that are absorbing the families after they've been released from detention facilities? What supports do we have in place for these families? How do we absorb them? How do we help them? How do we prepare them legally for the cases that they have ahead of them? And what are we doing for the long-term impact of child trauma that we have caused as a country? So part of the work that we're doing is seeding a real trauma-informed care response, trying to find organizations that have a specialty in that are going to serve the families and the children to make sure that the impact of what they've lived through does not continue generations on down the line. I think I'm going to stop there to allow Gerardo plenty of time to speak, but just to give you an overview, so the delegation is just the beginning of the work. The rest of the work is really trying to help the philanthropic sector truly understand their responsibility, and even if they don't focus on immigration per se, how they can still help the families.
Good morning. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity and inviting Hector and Abel. I continue to speak in Spanish. Mi nombre es Gerardo Sánchez y como leía la antecesora, pues soy un profesional de la televisión. Produzco actualmente 4 programas de televisión de enfoque a la comunidad latinoamericana en Estados Unidos. Y para mí es un privilegio poder compartir con ustedes las experiencias y los retos que tenemos como seres humanos en este país. O sea, no podemos omitir, solamente quisiera.
I'm going to translate for him, but I was just trying to signal to him that he's going too fast. He's Salvadorian, his name is Gerardo, he's a TV producer. He actually produces 4 different shows focused on the Central American community. And he is this morning with us to share his own experience as a TPS recipient.
Solamente voy a no a repetir lo de ellos, sino que me voy a enfocar en lo que concierne a los beneficios que el TPS me ha dado a mí y a más de 500,000 de personas que en este momento estamos en el limbo o en la cuerda floja.
I'm going to focus on what difference has TPS made not only for me, but nearly 500,000 people who were originally the beneficiaries of this program.
Pero quisiera tomarme unos 1 minuto y medio solamente para hacer enfoque en algo que se necesita y que debemos de hacer. Es bonita la reunión y poder estar acá dando nuestro punto de vista, pero debemos de llevar esto como lo ha llevado últimamente, como decía Abel, Hay 5 demandas a nivel nacional sobre lo que es la cancelación de los TPS, no solamente de El Salvador, sino que incluyendo Haití, Honduras, Nicaragua, que en este momento, como ustedes saben, los tepecianos estamos visitando los diferentes estados de la Unión Americana para hacer impacto en los gobiernos locales, en las oficinas de los senadores, pero también en la sociedad civil, que puedan conocer que nosotros estamos aquí no para dañar a este país, sino para contribuir a la economía de este país, formar nuevas culturas dentro de este país, pero también para contribuir a nuestras economías de nuestros países de orígenes.
I want to take a couple of minutes to, of course, congratulate the organizers of the event. I believe this is an important opportunity to share our stories, our perspectives. But I also want to make you aware of something that was mentioned. There are several lawsuits that have been filed surrounding the way in which TPS ending was decided. We think that that's a very important fight that needs to be known. We, as beneficiaries of TPS, have also become organized and take our stories to as many local governments, as many states as we can, so that we can help build understanding about the fact that we are here not only to contribute in enriching the United States of America with our presence, but in the process to also support our communities and our countries back home.
Pero antes quiero saludar a la embajadora de El Salvador aquí en los Estados Unidos, a la doctora Claudia Cangura y también a nuestra cónsul general que se une a esta conversación. Para nosotros es importante que ustedes estén presentes para poder apoyarnos y que conozcan también las ideas de los salvadoreños en el exterior.
I also want to state my gratefulness for the presence of the ambassador of El Salvador, Ambassador Cangura, and also the General Counsel in Maryland, I believe, is also here. I believe the presence of government officials in this event is important for the struggle that we are conducting.
Quería hacer énfasis en 2 puntos fundamentales. Nosotros como TPS carecemos incluso de lo que es el 100% de hablar inglés. O sea, esto nos limita a poder llevar un mensaje claro a las autoridades y al gobierno de los Estados Unidos.
One thing I want to mention is that many TPS recipients do not have full capacity to communicate our stories, our realities in English, and that is indeed a limitation that we face.
Por eso, hoy quiero aprovechar esta mañana que ustedes que son profesionales y que estamos en esta institución donde las leyes se conocen y se enseñan, quisiera pedirles que nos acompañen a hacer un cabildeo de alto nivel en el Congreso de Estados Unidos para que los senadores, tanto demócratas como republicanos, conozcan que los TPS estamos aquí para contribuir, como decía anteriormente.
And I want to take this opportunity to invite you to join TPS recipients who have already before and will continue to visit the U.S. Congress, precisely to try to convey to members of Congress who we are, what do we represent for the country, and we would love to partner with people, especially in a place like this, a place where the law is taught to students, to have you partner with us in this effort.
Pero para eso, como decía Abel y decía nuestra compañera Nancy, aquí se necesitan recursos y se necesita dinero. Como decimos los que somos centroamericanos, salvadoreños, ¿verdad? Pisto, ¿verdad? Entonces, pero para esto yo creo que incluso, no sé si a través de nuestra embajadora se puede llevar claro un mensaje que incluso el país a través de los fondos que los Estados Unidos ha puesto en las manos para construir incluso proyectos de educación, proyectos de otra índole en nuestro país, si se pudiera que los países, no solamente El Salvador, estamos hablando de todos los países que están involucrados en esta crisis humanitaria que estamos viviendo, porque no solamente somos 200,000 salvadoreños, no, hablamos de más de 1 millón, porque incluimos nuestros hijos. Como ustedes escuchaban a Hector, pues en mi familia somos 5 documentados y 1 persona indocumentada que está a la espera de que haya una ley migratoria para poder solucionar nuestro problema. Pero al finalizar el TPS, que es el 9 de septiembre, si no me equivoco, cuando ya quedaremos nosotros como, digamos, como todos los 11 millones, o yo puedo atreverme más de 15 millones de inmigrantes que han venido a buscar el sueño americano sin documentos, y vamos a perder nuestras licencias de nuestras empresas. No solamente, Abel, los que tenemos las licencias comerciales de los traileros, sino que hay muchos estados que ya no están renovando las licencias porque el TPS tiene ya, muchos no hemos recibido la tarjeta de inmigración, y aunque inmigración extendió 6 meses más para poder recibir nuestra tarjeta, eso ellos no lo toman en consideración, y está mucha gente tomando sus propias atribuciones conforme ellos tienen en la mente dar el documento, y por eso, de hecho, aquí no me quisieron, en el estado de Washington, no me quisieron, de Distrito de Columbia, renovar la licencia de conducir. Entonces, hay muchas cosas que quisiera ir avanzando en esta plática.
And I want to go back to the question of resources, because to do what we need to be doing to protect TPS recipients, resources are absolutely critical, as it was pointed out by Abel and by Nancy. I also want to take advantage of Salvadorian government officials in the audience to also emphasize the fact that El Salvador and the other governments need to do more in as far as finding ways of being helpful on this challenge related to securing the resources necessary for us to be able to go forward. This is a crisis that will affect not only the TPS recipients per se, but I would dare to say close to 1 million people when you add our relatives. I'll give you my example in my own household. 5 of us have the benefit of counting with work permits to be in the US, but there is 1 member in my household who do not have any immigration status whatsoever. And this is the reality that takes me to say that there can be many, many more people than those who actually are able to, carry a work permit in the U.S. There is a problem that is already affecting us to the extent that many of the last permits that are supposed to be issued under TPS protection are delayed. And even though the federal government granted 6 months of grace period for expired permits, that's not something that local governments necessarily understand or accept. In my own case, my request to renew my driver license in the District of Columbia was denied simply because my permit says that my stay in the U.S. has expired. So clearly, as the dates come about in September, it is going to be important to keep in mind that a solution must be found.
¿Y a dónde quería llegar? Yo creo que solo los salvadoreños le inyectamos a la economía de El Salvador 500.21 millones de dólares anuales. Y si el gobierno destinara $500,000 o $1 millón de dólares para las organizaciones como Carecen, como las otras fundaciones que representa Hector, yo creo que podríamos tener un mayor impacto en el Congreso de los Estados Unidos, porque ustedes saben, se necesita para pagar un lobista tanto dinero, porque cuando nosotros llegamos, de hecho la semana pasada se hizo unas visitas al Congreso de Estados Unidos, ahí estaba Abel, no sé si usted estuvo ahí también, o a la cónsul llegó también, pero si ustedes saben, cuando uno llega, no le toman importancia, lo atiende el ayudante del secretario, ni el secretario se atreve a atendernos, o sea, nos atiende probablemente el portero que está en la puerta, porque ¿a quién vamos a ver? A nadie. Dejamos el papel y perdónenme que le diga, agarran el coso y le dicen, ¿quién vino? Vinieron los del TPS, tienen a la basura. Pero si ya llegara el abogado, llegara una comitiva, que lo han hecho, yo no estoy diciendo que no lo han hecho, pero yo creo de que se debería de hacer aquí en los Estados Unidos de profesionales dentro que hablen un buen, perfecto inglés para que puedan respaldarnos a tanto los DACA como los TPS, que es urgente que el gobierno de los Estados Unidos siga con este programa que beneficia y que también pondría en un caos a estos cientos de miles de familias que he mencionado.
I want to emphasize, going back to the issue of what the national governments can do, that El Salvador alone receives billions of dollars on a yearly basis from hardworking Salvadorians in the U.S. So we would love to see the Salvadorian government coming forward, with resources to be able to help us actually have the money necessary to strengthen our advocacy capacity We would like not just us going to congressional offices to visit and lobby, but we would like to be able to get as many allies as possible that we believe can help us elevate the quality of the advocacy effort vis-a-vis the U.S. Congress. And it is this kind of efforts that we must be able to continue to do, but we need more resources to be able to do it. I am grateful for all the organizations that are already doing this kind of work on behalf of TPS recipients, but far more is necessary.
Y bueno, las preguntas que me preparaba Héctor era al respecto de que cómo el TPS a mí me ha beneficiado. Yo creo de que ha sido una puerta, o mejor dicho, una llave para abrir la puerta y comenzar aquí en este país en mi sueño, mi profesión. O sea, yo tengo 4 cursos que estudié en mi país. Empecé a estudiar la administración de empresas, solamente pude cruzar 3 años de administración de empresa. No porque no pude seguir continuando, sino que me dediqué a otros oficios. Soy graduado de mecánica general de la 3ª Brigada de Infantería. También estudié medicina veterinaria, estudié radio y televisión. Y viniendo a los Estados Unidos me puse a estudiar, y el poco inglés que sé, pues se lo debo a Carlos Rosario, porque estudié 3 niveles de inglés en Carlos Rosario. Y después me fui al Montgomery College y estudié realización y producción de televisión. Y por eso es que me ha dado las herramientas el TPS, ¿verdad?, para poder yo producir mis propios programas de televisión y ayudar de alguna forma a mantener conectada a nuestra comunidad con la opinión de los latinoamericanos, porque no solamente hacemos para los salvadoreños, aunque sí, ¿verdad? Un 70% es para mi comunidad y otro 30% lo dedico a las demás comunidades como Guatemala, Honduras, México y las demás comunidades que me piden apoyo. Pero creo de que el TPS ha sido la llave para abrir esta puerta que ahora pues me ha convertido no en un millonario, sino que en un empresario, de decir, estoy logrando el sueño americano, pero que estoy lográndolo, todavía no se ha logrado, tengo muchos sueños que lograr, pero ¿qué pasará cuando después del 9 de septiembre, bueno, salí diciendo el pensamiento se quiebra? A veces uno cómo crear una vida, un propósito de seguir adelante luchando, cuando de repente por uno que hace una cosa mala, por una persona que se porta mal, por una persona que no quiere seguir las leyes. Habemos miles y miles que hemos respetado las leyes de este país, y que este país, por una persona que no tiene nada de humanista como lo es el señor Donald Trump, o sea, te ponga en esta situación tan difícil, cuando sabemos que este país ha sido un país construido por inmigrantes, que han venido los holandeses, los europeos, los centroamericanos, los salvadoreños han construido este país. Decía un mensaje en el cabildeo del martes pasado de que los latinos, centroamericanos y salvadoreños hemos construido después del terremoto de New Orleans, a Houston, estamos contribuyendo después de los atentados terroristas, construimos el Pentágono y volvimos a quitar los escombros de la zona de las Torres Gemelas en Nueva York. Entonces, a veces el sentimiento viene a nuestra mente porque tú dices, yo no me vine de este país a este país por delincuente. Si vienen algunos por delincuentes, las leyes los tienen que perseguir y hacerlos pagar lo que ellos deben. Pero muchos de nosotros estamos aquí por lograr un sueño y no venimos con la esperanza de decir, bueno, voy a lograr el sueño y después me voy a regresar. No, sino que de contribuir a la cultura de este país, y hemos adoptado a este país como parte de otra nación, de otra tierra que nosotros no conocíamos. Así como en los tiempos de los antiguos que buscaban unas tierras mejores para salir adelante. Pero lamentablemente a un pequeño número de americanos se les ha olvidado de dónde viene este país, de dónde viene esta historia. Y lamentablemente es indignante ver que nos discriminen a cada uno de nosotros solo por no tener, como les dije al principio, la capacidad de defendernos. Porque si ustedes vieron también hace 3 semanas, haciendo mi trabajo en las calles, un policía llega y ve mi perfil. O sea, La gente me criticó y dice, bueno, hey, Chero, debes de hablar mejor inglés. Y a veces uno no es que no lo pueda hablar, sino que a veces cuando te ofenden te pones nervioso y a veces no puedes ni explicarlo. A veces ves cuando te pones nervioso o el sentimiento te gana, a veces también hasta el español te cuesta hablarlo. Entonces llega un policía de parques del condado de Anne Arundel, estaba yo transmitiendo en vivo y llega el policía y me agarra el teléfono, me pega en la cara y me dobla el brazo. Entonces, si ustedes van ahí en Así es mi gente TV, encuentran ustedes el video. Lo quité de YouTube porque había puesto mal la policía. Estaba yo mencionando la policía de Laurel, pero era el policía de parques. Pero ¿qué sucede? Ahora cualquiera te puede ofender solo por verte que sos latino. Ahora cualquiera te puede, entonces, pero si tú no tienes la capacidad para poder, ¿a dónde vas? ¿A dónde vas? ¿Quién te apoya? O sea, es bien difícil la situación que se está viviendo. No solamente con los tepecianos, sino que incluso vemos que ha salido esta semana que las personas que son residentes también van a tener consecuencias mayores si han cometido un delito menor o se les puede cancelar hasta su residencia permanente. Yo creo que esto no debe de permitirse. Ustedes son gente que Dios les ha permitido lograr una carrera universitaria y que tienen las bases para seguir impulsando este tipo de proyectos en el Congreso y en el Senado, a donde debemos de entrar, donde debemos de abrir. Dejemos aquí el partidarismo, dejemos aquí las ideologías políticas. Vámonos y hablemos con los congresistas, sean demócratas o republicanos, para que entiendan que los latinos como ellos, que los inmigrantes como ellos, hemos venido a contribuir a este país.
Okay, that's a long shot. I will not do full justice, but I'll try to give you a quick summary of what Gerardo was sharing. He began by answering the question of what has TPS meant for him. And he basically described TPS as the key that allowed him to open up doors, open up windows, that allowed him to make the best of the education he was able to get in his own country, El Salvador, and be able to pursue something that has been a dream for him, which is to produce TV content through the programs that he produces, primarily for Salvadorian nationals, but also for other Central American communities in the area. However, he fears that as of the 9th of September of next year comes about, and he almost broke in tears as he was saying this, he's very worried that ability to pursue his dreams, will come to a halt, simply because his status may indeed come to an end on that day. He believes that it is extremely unfair the way foreign nationals, especially if they happen to be Latin Americans, are being attacked. People seem to forget that we broke our backs helping rebuild New Orleans, helping rebuild Houston, helping rebuild the Pentagon after the 9/11 attacks in the US. And all of a sudden, people want to believe that because every now and then there may be indeed a criminal who happens to be a foreign national, that all foreign nationals are to be blamed. People have to remember that this is indeed a nation that was built by multiple immigrant communities throughout the history. But it is really sad and heartbreaking to see how the environment has changed. He recounted a recent encounter he had with a park police, where just because he was speaking in Spanish, the police came in a very aggressive manner, hit him in the face, took away his phone, and all of this is actually on video because he was being recorded as he was doing all this. And it kind of exemplifies how people under this particular administration, the Trump administration, feel so empowered to attack somebody just because they look the way he does, just because they may not speak English fluently. And he was explaining that even if you are just English speaker and you are assaulted by a police, you may have a hard time explaining in your own language, what you're going through. Forget if you don't actually speak fully a language like the US. He emphasized the fact that yes, they were born someplace else, but they have clearly adopted the United States of America as their new home, as their new homeland. And they want to make sure that we talk to anybody and everybody, especially in Congress, without differentiating political parties, so that they can tell their story better, so that people can understand what PPS recipients and other immigrants really represent for the United States of America.
He is good translate, right? Okay, thank you. Muchas gracias. Ha sido un honor haber conversado con ustedes y que hayan escuchado estos puntos de vista. Sé que hay muchos temas que hablar, pero juntos lo vamos a lograr. Yo estoy aquí para servirles. También si ustedes quieren producir un programa, nosotros estamos para hacerlo. Y pues yo creo de que este es el momento, las redes sociales fueran un papel muy importante para llevar nuestro mensaje. Muchas gracias y que Dios los bendiga.
For allowing me to be here this morning, share my story. I want you to know that I'm willing to help. You know, I am, as I said, a TV producer, and my crew is here too. So we are happy to work with you all. If we need to produce, you know, more content, especially for social media, given how powerful it's become, count in me an ally in this struggle. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much for our panelists. That was really amazing, and I think delivered beyond my expectations about what we were going to cover here today. We have one more very brief speaker, and then we'll go to the audience. There are a lot of you who have been providing leadership in this space, working hard on the ground to meet the needs caused by this man-made crisis. The YWCA, as Nancy mentioned earlier, is one of those organizations. I want to introduce briefly Silvia Acosta, who's the CEO of the YWCA in El Paso, who I had the privilege of hearing speak at a protest at the border at Tornillo. The YWCA is not your grandma's YWCA. They are fierce and they are advocates for women and for our community. So Silvia.
Thank you. I will be brief. I'm from YWCA El Paso, as mentioned. The YWCA El Paso is the largest YWCA in the United States, and we are ground zero. The Tornillo Detention Center opened and was the first facility to house children that were separated from their families. So today, I'm here as their voice. I'm here as the voice for those parents and for those children because they can't speak. I have been fortunate enough to be able to be part of a community that has provided support for these families through Annunciation House and through the Loreto Nazareth House in El Paso. Our organization, as well as many individuals in El Paso, volunteered as we took in these families and these children and got to see that trauma firsthand. We saw the children disconnected from their parents, not really knowing what had happened to them, having in extreme detachment because they were children that were just walking, barely learning how to walk. Mothers and fathers that grieved that loss of time with their children, that felt like they had lost that moment and that crucial bonding time with their children. And now these children will live with that trauma. And they will live with that trauma for the rest of their lives. And as the YWCA, we are very concerned about that. We've been, and I'm glad that Nancy mentioned the work that we were doing, but the other thing we've been working on is a trauma-informed childcare curriculum for early learning, for the youngest of children, that's social, emotional, and deals with trauma, because we can't just think that these children are gonna go back to their lives the way they ordinarily did. So my time is very limited, but I want to tell you that we're out there and we will be their voices. And it's not just the YWCA, it's so many organizations in this country that have decided that there's a better path and there's a better way. And this is not the way that we as Americans should treat children and families. I go back to Jose's comment when we started this forum. It is cruel to separate families. There's no question about that. There is no doubt about that. And there should be no argument or legislation that supports that effort. So thank you so much for your time. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Silvia. I have a question or two for the panel, but I'd really like to get to the audience questions. So we have a microphone here, or we can pass it around to you. Just let us know if anybody has a question. So thank you, Silvia. So I have a question for the panel. Since we're in DC, I want to ask about legislative solutions. Abel, you made the point very beautifully that, yes, we may have a new Congress. Yes, we may have legislative solutions. There were 4 bills in this past Congress, 2 of which were very good, to try and that would have provided a permanent solution for TPS holders who currently live 18 months to 18 months for the past 20 years. But, you know, we hope that will happen again, but that's not going to be in time, right? Because so many people are going to be losing it in a few months. The first one's in January and the rest in the coming year. What are besides legislative solutions, besides legislative strategies, what can we do? And feel free to line up for questions or raise your hand.
I can take a stab quickly to that question. First of all, I don't think we should give up, on the legislative solutions. What I would challenge everybody is to rethink, the architecture of legislative solutions. None of the bills that are presently filed, given the fact that the majority of them are Democratic-led, has much of a chance of passing. That's just being utterly realistic. But perhaps what we need to ask is what kind of architecture, may represent not a long-lasting solution, but a short-term solution that will make people like Gerardo not come to the 10th of September and be back in the situation he was before he became a CPS recipient. So, I don't want to take more time except to say we need to be more creative. And we need to redefine, what it means, short-term compromises that don't do more harm and that can potentially attract both Democrats and Republicans. I insist, not on a long-lasting solution, but on a Band-Aid, literally. And because the other avenues of fight, frankly, we don't know when they will produce results. I love the class action lawsuits that have been filed, but nobody can assure anybody that by the due dates of the different expiration moments next year, we will have a solution in hand. Maybe an injunction, maybe, but we just don't know.
So you're saying be practical. Let's be a little more practical, get what we can get, something that at least will help people sooner.
Without giving up,
Yeah.
The real good fight that we still need to fight. So.
Yeah, Abel?
Yeah, I would add that, immigration legislation happens at the federal level, but people live in communities, right? Immigrants live in communities. So we need to be better at partnering with local municipalities to ensure that immigrants are integrated well into the community. So beyond funding for legal service providers, we need funding from local municipalities for education, for health, for mental health. I see a compañera from the Clínica del Pueblo, they do an incredible job of providing services here to the DC area. Gerardo mentioned Carlos Rosario, which is education. So we need to sort of bring together all these partners, at least in the areas that can, and do it, because that's gonna be the immediate change while we continue working on the legislation and changing the political sort of landscape.
Great. I'd like to acknowledge the ambassador from El Salvador.
Well, thank you very much for all your remarks. But I want to tell other things. For example, I understand that we can't give up on the legislative fix. We have to continue working in that. But I just want to remember that when the government of El Salvador began to make the lobby for the TPS, in the Congress, just few congressmen or congresswomen knew about TPS. You know, when our former Minister of Foreign Affairs talked about TPS, they said, TPS what? What is TPS? So we began to make a lobby, and we have visited many offices of them, and now they are close to our embassies, to our team, to our governments. And you know, there are 5 bills. And I think that even if the bills won't pass, because we have to be realistic and to understand that maybe they won't pass, but there's a seed over there. And from that seed, we can continue the dialogue. I agree that we have to construct or to rebuild or to strengthen a net, because we did the first, as first statement, as first premise, that we had to create a net that was not only focused on the federal level, but on the state level and on the local level. What you just mentioned, the municipalities. But we have to look for the state level and to all the levels. And I am here also to tell you that we can work with you together. Some of you know me, or we can share some impressions, but we can work with you in a properly way. I mean, not just to meet in those activities, but just to go to the places where the issue is. For example, just let me tell you, we are interested in doing a visit in El Paso, because the issue of the fact that the government goes to the shelter and look what are the conditions where the kids are, it's something that politically is interesting not only for the government of the U.S., it's interesting for our people, for our government. So I invite you to be close also to our embassy and to our team and to the teams of the others countries, and to work together in both issues. You know, there has been our both priorities, TPS and the separation of families, and we can work together. But another thing that I want to tell you, because I can't let it go, you know, talking about the narrative, that I agree that we have to rebuild our narrative, because we have been talking with some points, and maybe there's a time when we have to construct another narrative, and we have to include other issues. But in terms of narco-traffics, I want to clarify that the Central America region does not provide drugs. We are not consumers, and we are just a region of transit. Obviously, the social exclusion, the poverty of our people make our people vulnerable to work with the gangs, with other challenges that we have. But we don't produce drug because our land is not able to get a crop of drug. And we don't consume drug. For the Central American countries, I mean, I can tell from my country, the drug consumed is not a health a public health issue. We don't have that problem. So we don't provide drug to the U.S. It's just the transit that we make. In our case, in El Salvador, we have a monitoring base in our airport. And from that place, we control the transit of the drug. And there have been years, for example, in 2016, that we have interdicted more than 10,000 kilograms of cocaine. And we send it to the giants. We are the second largest partner from the U.S. Only Panama is a strong partner to the U.S. in the interdictions of drugs. So we contribute to that problem, and we are not part of the problem directly.
It's very important to clarify that.
you
Thank you
very
so
much.
much.
Sorry.
No, thank you so much. We're going to bring the microphone over here. Yeah. I'm going to let you both ask your questions, and then we'll,
First of all,
yes.
Rudy Arredondo with the National Latino Farmers and Ranchers Trade Association. And I want to thank Laura and Hispanic and all the organizations that put this together. You know, the act in terms of that was mentioned by our guest here from El Paso, it's a state, and it's not just cruel, but it's an official state act, which I consider criminal. But one of the concerns that I have is we represent about 75,000 Latino farmers and ranchers throughout the United States. We own about 32 million acres, and we generate about $8 billion of sales annually. That's by official USDA statistics. The concern that I have is that many of those farmers who came to the United States as a result of NAFTA, or the ones that are the core group of our organization. And the concern that I have is with these raids, is one of the things that I'm very concerned about is the fact that we need to protect the assets of those folks in their caught in a raid. So we have hired one attorney to help us to put together try to see if we can work with other organizations with like-minded, because we need to protect those assets for those families that remain here in the United States. And thank you for everything you do. And you know, we need to, first of all, the Congress, I'm not very optimistic that in this cycle, political cycle, we're going to get anything out of the Congress. The thing that we need to do is, as a community, organize ourselves. We need to be strong because we have all these stovepipes. You know, I hope that we have some, like the Green Latinos. It's a big organization with some resources that we can tap into. But all these organizations, and I'm very happy that Laura invited me to be here, because this is important to me in seeing that we unite and we organize ourselves as a collective group nationally. I was just at Chicago. I just had an opportunity to meet with a transition team from López Obrador, because that is important to us as we negotiate this NAFTA, and as well as in terms of our own farm bill that is here stuck at the Congress. So thank you very much for what you do, and thank you.
Thank you, Rudy. Brent, go ahead. We're just going to let all of you speak, and then, because we promised we would, so please.
All right, thank you. I'll try to be brief then. So I guess I have two questions. First question has to do with helping the Central American countries recover from the devastation that they experienced, as Oscar went through in the 70s and 80s. And I know the ambassador talked about all the good things that are happening, but I do think, you know, if the security issues and the economic issues weren't a concern, then we wouldn't be experiencing the pressure right now for families to try to come here and apply for asylum. And as much as it's important to talk about the needs of the folks who do make it here and to address those needs, and that's first priority, obviously, we also should think about how can we help both as a community, but as a government, how can we get our government to do more to help the Central American countries? Because we did have a role in destabilizing that area. They were part of this whole effort in the Cold War to try to beat back communism. Now the communists are our friends, apparently, but in the old days, we were fighting against Russia, and the proxy battles happened in Central America. So we have a responsibility to do something about that. And can we turn this narrative around and saying it's our responsibility to help these countries get back on their feet? The second question has to do with Donald Trump again, actually. And you know, he just yesterday used his bully pulpit to say that if Democrats win control of the House, that they'll be flooding our streets with criminal aliens that are killers and all kinds of awful things. I mean, he just, rather than acting more presidential, which some of us had hoped would happen, he's actually getting worse and worse. The problem is our Latino voices aren't responding in a way that we get equal time in the press. The press airs his comments live, and nary a Latino leader gets a chance to respond in the same format to as many people. And so my question for the panel is, what can we do to change that? And is it time to think about perhaps creating a Latino war room where as soon as the president makes an outrageous comment, there's a response immediately to that, and that we let the press know we need equal time with the president. If you're going to let this guy bash our communities over and over again, we need to have a chance to respond, because it's unfair and it's actually affecting policy when we don't get our chance to explain how things really are for our communities. Those are my two questions.
That's a great point. Yeah.
Hi, Daniela Bergi-Palomino with the Latin America Working Group. I wanted to thank all the panelists and the organizers for this great discussion, and recognize, you know, the particular focus that has been played on the transnational roots of the crisis that we're now seeing, from where really our immigration policies are coming from, the great analysis that Oscar gave, that all these did not exist and were created in a vacuum. I think we saw that with the DHS OIG report that came out yesterday on the zero tolerance policy, the lack of accountability mechanisms that these agencies have from their origins, and then also the U.S. foreign policy role in the so-called root causes of migration. And so my question is, and more of a comment perhaps, but that we've heard a lot about the transnational roots, and I would like the panelists to comment on a particular solution that I think my organization has had the privilege of working with Alianza Americas and some of the other panelists, which is, I think, very necessary in this debate, which is transnational civil society organizing. And while there are actions that can be done here and in the countries of origin, what particularly this means to the panelists, what are the limitations of it, and how we can amplify that also as a solution in this debate, transnational civil society organizing. Thank you.
Yeah, another great solution. Yeah, thank you.
Hello, my name is Irene Gomez, and I'm a fellow at the National Education Association. And I was wondering for the panelists, what specific actions would you recommend for educators and education leaders in order to support the immigrant community?
Thank you, and thank you to all the panelists and for all the work that you do. I'm Hector, I'm from the Embassy of Honduras, and I just wanted to mention 3 topics that have been mentioned. With regards to Congress, I also share the same realistic expectations about what's going to happen, and I agree that the most important thing is education. And I just want to give you an example. There was a congressman that had introduced a law to fine each country $2,000 per child that was apprehended at the border. And the importance of education, and I think that the optimal thing was for them to visit Honduras and see the conditions on the ground. After he came back, he presented a bill to say the aid that we give must go away from the central government and into, you know, social development and prosperity. So that radical change in his mindset is a great example of something that, you know, this country needs. And the other thing, the importance of electing your officials and how that really makes a difference. It's not about just what laws they're going to go propose in Congress or co-sponsor, because who you elect has a big impact on the attitude of the rest of the government. Like, what made it possible for a police officer to think it was okay to do what he did to Gerardo, and the attitude that creates in the rest of society to immigrants. So, yeah, thank you again for all the work that you do. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Hector. Our last comment here.
Hi, my name is Evelyn Arredondo Ramirez, and I'm a Cisneros Scholars with the Cisneros Hispanic Leadership Institute. And my question for the panel, and by the way, thank you for such a well-rounded discussion, is what is the strategy for people that are already deported and already on the other side and are displaced, and as Abel and Gerardo mentioned, like they don't know the way that the system works in other countries in Central America, and so how can we better help those that are adjusted? So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, boy, there's a lot of great questions there. I think to Hector's point about education, I mean, that is one of the purposes of these forums. This is the first of a series of forums that we'll be doing like this across the country, Chicago and San Francisco and Miami, places where you think, and New York, places where you think, well, people are very, maybe El Paso, where people are very informed about immigration. But as we've seen and heard so many examples, there is really not a lot of information about TPS. And the fact that, he's already setting up to go to El Paso here. The fact that this is the largest separation of families that is looming, that is beginning in a few months, is really something that we have got to get the word out about across the country. So thank you for that. And to Brent's point about destabilizing, one of the ways that we have been able to contribute to stabilization in those countries is through the remittances that TPS holders here who are working are able to send to their families and send to their countries. And that is another, whether it's an unintended consequence or not, the ending TPS here will contribute greatly to destabilization in those countries that are already struggling to stabilize. So I'm just going to briefly say the questions again, answer whatever you can, don't feel compelled to answer. Our panelists will be here afterwards to discuss with you if we don't get to your question.
And Lara, we have 10 minutes, just so it's got to be super truncated. We have
May
Yes.
I suggest that you give us perhaps 2 minutes each to maybe respond? Because I took note of all the questions.
Okay, so I won't go through them. So
Just to save a little.
90 seconds each.
Yeah, that's fine, that's fine. Let me set an example.
I don't think
90
that one's
seconds.
on.
I am so happy to hear some of the suggestions and questions. I would invite you dearly to visit alianzaamericas.org. We were founded to do a lot of the things that some of you have recommended that we do. So far, we have failed to gain traction. I would say that would take forever to try to answer. I just did an hour and a half yesterday with a class in Arizona, which we will be putting online in the next couple of days. So I invite you to check our website. I go in detail about what kind of good, helpful role could we play, as a U.S. government. And the last comment I will make is, look, Latinos are already the second largest group in the country after white Europeans. Yet, we are mostly missing in action when it comes to foreign policy. We just have not really touched. We have not really dived into U.S. foreign policy.
And the
we
media.
should be first and foremost concerned about Latin America, frankly, the rest of the world too. So I think that's a challenge yet to be met.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have a sort of a couple of comments. First, the protection of assets of immigrants, and that's something that we're looking into because there is an interaction of the federal government, the local government, and private industry, and so they're independent of the status. Immigrants can get bank accounts, and so when they find that they are in the process of being deported, then that people focus on their status and their ability to stay in the country and kind of think of secondhand what it means to protect their assets. And so part of it is bringing, when I mean, to create a network, it's not just of legal service providers in the immigration field, but it's about, we need people that are specialists in finance. We need people that are specialists in trust and, and the ability to protect your family so that if you are deportable, who takes care of your minor children? Who take care of your assets, and those are not as simple as, my cousin, my brother, doesn't work that way. It has to really be a thought process which a lot of the skill sets really are for just anybody, not just for immigrants. I mean, a lot of us do not do a good job with our own personal finances. This is about really educating about all of your assets, medical records, school records, and how you are able to make them portable, so that if you, again, make the choice to go back or are forced back, then you can take that with you, and that allows you to integrate better. The one about sort of more of the foreign policy, and I'll pick what Oscar said, and I would simply say that as a local community organization that does the work in DC, I'm in a very sort of privileged space because I participate with a lot of the Latino national groups. I also participate with a lot of the organizations that do sort of the foreign policy work, and those two worlds are completely separated. There is a hard wall. We're talking about building walls. There's a wall that exists. I have been in spaces where you have organizations that are leading the fight for Latino rights that plainly say, we don't do foreign. We don't do foreign. It's not our thing. And you have the organizations that do that work that don't necessarily do the domestic bucket. And so we need to do a better job as organizations, and I happen to work with both folks, and we need to break that wall. And we need to make sure that we're talking to each other, that really, because the foreign work informs the domestic policy informs the foreign policy. And, you know, to your point, like, we need to do work ourselves.
90 seconds.
Yeah. So I'll leave it at that. So I think it's breaking down our own walls before we even start leaving the U.S.
Thank you.
Okay, got it. And I'm gonna go as fast as I can, Laura. So,
Okay.
to your point around financial asset protection, you have a class of financial institutions in this country that are nonprofit organizations that are alternative to the banking system, that did everything from protecting homeowners during the mortgage crisis, that are looking at things now. And the folks that come to mind are like the Latino Community Development Credit Union in North Carolina, that are doing everything from creating these global bank cards where you can deposit money here and your family members can get it out in other countries. There are ways to work it. So I think the community development financial institutions and community development credit unions are part of the solution to help families figure out how you protect assets and how you can move across countries and boundaries. So that's that one, and I think it's a conversation that's worth being had. On the issue of, and the legal pieces just in general, I've never given so much money in all my life to the ACLU, and they'll keep getting my money, because I think that those are just the tools that we have, and we need to utilize them. On the communications efforts, there's a lot of conversations around this, but we have not organized as a group. I think Hispanic Federation had a perfect example of how you manage comms around like a natural disaster in Puerto Rico. I think we have to think about how we do it around collective issues, right? So we can do it on, we've been doing a good job of individual issues, but how do we do it about a collective narrative? And I think that a good example of that was something I worked on in education a gazillion years ago, and I was looking for Estuardo, but he's left, because maybe this is like a Raven type project, where we had lobbyists, communication people, lawyers, you name it, give an hour a week for kids. They give an hour of pro bono time to help us kind of build this big package around early childhood education way back when. It almost seems like we need something similar in the comm space, where we get some of the bright minds that we have out there to find a way to give back, maybe not in like financial research, but in their time and kind of intellectual capital. Transnational Civic Organizing, Camina Project. That's CAMMINA, and that's the work that's happening around the Migration Corridor. Education Association, Casey Family Foundations, and the Annie E. Casey Foundation are looking at the impact of this trauma on children, and I think putting pressures there works.
Thank you, Nancy. Gerardo?
No, I want to say, say only thank you. Y que todos salgan a votar el próximo noviembre, porque es bien importante el voto, y que se haga una...
Thank you so much.
Can I say just one thing that I think is crucially important about this event?
Okay, sure.
Very quickly, look, it was not necessarily planned to be this way, but you have 3 immigrants in this panel talking about an issue that is largely a Latino issue. You don't see that in other events. And I go to a lot of events. And so I just want to applaud the fact that we are living up to elevating the voices of our own communities.
That's a perfect segue to our closing. We thank you again, everybody, for coming. I mean, we just have to intensify the call for action against all of these policies that seek to separate families. We have to do it even when the media is no longer paying attention. Because in the end, when the hoopla is over and the spotlight dies down, it's our immigrant communities, our organizations that serve them that are going to be left to pick up the slack. But it is this country that will pay the ultimate price if we continue to treat immigrants as disposable and unwanted. As I mentioned in the beginning, 1 in 4 children in the U.S. has an immigrant parent. These policies are an attack on children. Please stay vigilant, stand up, and speak out. Thank you so much for coming.
Well said, Laura.